welcome Moritz Schularick, which is author, among other things, but also author of the new edition to the Forum's working paper series. Moritz has written for us a paper on new perspectives on monetary policy, where you rediscuss a bit the role or the mandate of central banks. And you also predict, in a way, or hypothesize that central banks will look quite differently from now in 10 to 20 years. In your paper, you cover some of the challenges that central banks are facing. You do mention that there are also others to be considered, but you focus mainly on distributional aspects, on risky financial sector, and you also claim that the so-called divine coincidence sort of no longer holds, meaning that keeping levels of inflation stable does not mean anymore, or that there are indeed trades-off between keeping inflation stable and levels of employment or levels of welfare overall. And this does seem all the more relevant now, given the current situation with inflation, and also given that the Fed seems to have embraced a hawkish approach, so to say, and that we'll probably see several rounds of rate hikes during this year. But yes, let us start from the why. Why would central banks need a new mandate? Tell us a bit more about the challenges and the aspects that they should consider, in your opinion.
Right, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to do this and talk to you. Let me start with a disclaimer. So this essay is an exercise in let's call it out-of-the-box thinking about central bank mandates and how they evolve. Central bank mandates are not set in stone. They have been historically changing. They have expanded and at sometimes been reduced. There have been some constants over time, but there are a few things coming together at this juncture in time where I think we will look at central banking 10 years from now in a very different way to what we do today. And I tried to summarize or like to discuss three potential challenges to what we do now and how we define central bank mandates today that have come up in recent research, and as you rightly say, also in recent practice where central banks have started to do things that might take them down in a different direction. Let me start also by saying that I looked at three. There are more. For example, there's the question about the role of central banks in fighting climate change. There are two interesting books that have come out recently, one in France by Eric Monet and one in Germany, that talk about the potential role of central banks in supporting the ecological transformation by engaging in maybe not direct lending, but certainly in playing a more active role again in the real economy like they did in the 50s and 60s in many countries. And there's also the big question, of course, about how do we think about central bank independence when so much government debt is owned by central banks. So these are two other questions, but not the one I really focused on in this report. I think there is a confluence of factors right now that will lead to a very different role and mandate of central banks 10, 15 years from now.
When you talk about a new mandate, you certainly mean a more enlarged mandate, probably more power as well, if we want, for central banks. What do you think could this mean in the EU, what could this mean for the European central bank? Would this be some sort of dual mandate, or how would you envision this?
Right. So let me start by saying that my analysis is very much a positive one, not a normative one. I'm not saying this is where we should go. I'm not necessarily saying it's a good development for time being. I'm thinking this is just the direction we're headed to, and there are lots of open questions. And for researchers like me, that's of course super interesting. I don't think that we will. I think that the common denominator of what will happen is that central banks will have to become more democratically accountable. I think the idea of the times when central bankers were appointed technocrats sitting in some ivory tower and getting to do their price stability and stabilization mandates without any, like not any, but with very little some democratic entanglement and being part of the political process. I think these days are over. And we see that everywhere. We see that in the US, where the Federal Reserve has clearly become more politicized. We see that right now with the new appointments. We also see that in Europe, where the questions of green finance or monetary policy and its role in climate change, but also the entanglement with the fiscal side, with the bond buying programs that have generated large holdings of government debt at the ECB. Well, these questions are no longer technocratic questions that can be solved at a distance. And there are, in my essay, I discuss other challenges that go in the same direction. One is, I think we have all now to some extent realized that what central banks do has distributional effects. What does that mean? It means that what central banks do helps the wealth or the income or the employment situation of some groups more than others. We are still very much debating who is at the winning end and who is at the losing end, or who is like winning more of these policies. We have some reason to believe that in the end, most people are better off. But there are clearly challenges that have come up, both on the research side, but also in the practical side, where central banks in 10 years, even more than today, will be more democratically more part of the democratic process, and will have more scrutiny because I think one big factor here is that their power has expanded so much in the last 20 years, and they partly are the only game in town, especially in countries where the political situation is a little bit dysfunctional. That enormous power that has accrued to central bankers in the last few decades will progressively, I think that's a reasonably safe forecast, will progressively be taken back under some kind of democratic oversight.
Yeah. I mentioned in the beginning this concept, which I find very interesting, which, as you said in the paper, Blanchard and colleagues have coined, of the divine coincidence. Would you like to explain a bit more why this no longer holds? What new theoretical challenges have come towards this concept?
Right. So what has happened on the research front in the past decade is something that is a very important development. I think one where we still at the very beginning of research in many ways, is the development of macroeconomic thinking or macroeconomic models that have arrived in the mainstream now, and that are my colleagues in Bonn, for example, but also others are very much at the sort of forefront of leading these developments, where we study the macroeconomy consisting not only of representative agents, but of heterogeneous agents. What does that mean? It's a complicated word. It just means that some we're not all the same. Some of us are rich and some of us are poor. Some of us have a good education, some of us have a bad education. Some of us have portfolios that are dominated by houses and others have cash in the bank, etc., etc. And these differences between individuals in the economy then means that whatever a centralized monetary policy does has new different transition channels and transmission channels for monetary policy. It has effects on, for example, if you have a lot of equity, a lot of stocks in your portfolio, and the monetary policy changes drive up stock prices, then you profit more from that, at least for some time, than someone who has his savings or her savings in the bank. So there are all these distributional effects that can arise, and we're at the very beginning of understanding how strong they are, how long they last, how important they are. But one implication of this can be, but I think it's true generally of a class of heterogeneous agent models, that the concept of divine coincidence, which meant that by stabilizing inflation, central banks would also automatically stabilize output, or production and employment, no longer holds. That means there are trade-offs, again, between how much inflation you want and how much unemployment you want, which is something that was in the sort of older and now, I guess, a little bit simplistic looking models, a trade-off that wasn't there. So that is a big theoretical challenge, because the idea, if you look at the ECB mandate, for example, was very much built around or on that idea that all you need to do is stabilize the price level, and that would automatically also stabilize output around potential. That is no longer true in these models. So we need to rethink about how we want to, quite literally trade off inflation versus growth and employment.
Sure. Exactly. We've already mentioned, we already spoke about the ECB, but there's a last question, which is more a bit of an opinion question that is not part of your paper. But given that we have a fresh new president of the Bundesbank, I'm sort of obliged to ask, do you think there is any chance that the new president of the Bundesbank will be open to such new mandate, or even consider an openness towards this direction? I think
the Bundesbank is probably an unlikely place to start a revolution, but I think there is generally an openness in the central banking community, which is also due to the fact that the central banking community, certainly internationally and slowly but surely also in Europe, has become much more academic, in the sense that it's been generally understood that what central banks do is so important that you just can't, that you cannot give these important institutions into the brightest minds that the country has, and that has happened in some countries, and so I think this debate that is very prominent and active in the academic world will come to the central banking. Well, it's already there. If you think about climate change, sometimes even there, maybe it comes more from the central banks than from the academics, but there is a very constant and intense exchange between the two, between the academic world and the central banking world. So these topics will, and they already are. We have this paper on the distributional effects of monetary policy in the US, and we've presented this at many central banks because people are interested. One of the big paradigms of the old days was that we do stabilization policy through central banks with monetary policy, because it does not have distributional effects, unlike fiscal policy, which takes from some and gives to others. Now we come back and think like, hang on, monetary policy also has distributional effects. So the lines between fiscal and monetary also blur in that respect. At the same time, we have seen how effective and very powerful fiscal policy can be. We've seen that in the pandemic, that stabilization policy worked very well, we've generally speaking done much better in stabilizing the economy and even getting out of that slump in the pandemic than we did after the global financial crisis. Back then, we've tried really hard on the monetary side. We haven't really pushed hard on the fiscal side. On the contrary, in some countries, there's been austerity programs. So I think there's a very much a reconsideration going on between monetary and fiscal policy as stabilization tools. And that is driven by the quite evident success of using fiscal policy in the pandemic, and by the growing questions around the effectiveness and the distributional effects of monetary policy in stabilizing the economy. So where this will lead us in 10, 15 years is an open question, but I think we are at a moment in time, maybe just like in 1968, when Milton Friedman gave his famous presidential address to the American Economic Association, where he essentially threw out fiscal policy as a stabilization tool and said we should do monetary because that is the best way to stabilize. And I think we are at an inflection point again, where we reconsider fiscal and its effectiveness and its power in the short term, stabilizing the economy, and where we have bigger questions about some of the assumptions that were underlying the old monetary stabilization paradigm. There is a fascinating, there's really a fascinating window that will open in the future with digital currencies to reconceptualize monetary policy and blur the two even more. Let me just throw this out. Think about a world where everyone has an account at the central bank, and when there's a recession, the central bank just transfers 1,000 euros to everyone. Is that monetary policy? Is that fiscal policy? Well, it's a mix of both. Is that potentially much more effective in stabilizing the economy than changing some interest rate that through some doubtful transmission mechanisms that we don't understand very well, work their ways through financial markets into the real economy, potentially. So we should explore all these things. So technology there too will change very much the face of stabilization policy in years to come. So these are fascinating and interesting times.
They are indeed. Let us see if, or rather when, your predictions will come true. Thank you very much, Moritz. Thank you for the paper, for the interview, or this little teaser for your paper, which will be published on our website in a couple of days. For anyone who wants to read it, it's free to download. Yes, thank you very much, and we'll see each other soon in one of our next events.
Wonderful, thank you.